The year is 1977, and famous sports writer George Plimpton is thinking back to the big heist of 1971, subject to the recent Netflix show, because he had been down there. Again, he was maybe the most famous sports writer in the world at that point, to cover Ali's comeback fight against Jerry Quarry. It was being held in Atlanta because nowhere else would sanction Ali to fight.
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the man responsible for bringing the fight to Atlanta, Georgia, Senator Leroy Johnson.
We were successful almost a year ago in bringing Muhammad Ali back to the ring. When some 65 cities throughout the country refused to let him fight, we brought him back and he fought here in Atlanta.
Taking his case all the way to the Supreme Court as a conscientious objector, lost some of what probably would have been the prime years of his career because he refused to, as a black man, fight the yellow man for the white man, to quote him. So George Plimpton's writing a book, and it's 1977, and he's thinking about the big heist because that was the most interesting thing that happened at the fight. I mean, the fact that Ali was coming back was interesting, but him beating Quarry was kind of a foregone conclusion. So he calls up Muhammad Ali's manager, Bundini Brown. If you're into boxing, you've heard of him. Bundini Brown was known to enjoy various street entertainments, gambling, get high, and he starts asking Bundini about the big heist, the robbery of that game where all the black mafia people were at in 71 and the fallout. And Bundini tells him, well, you should talk to Frank Moten. Of course, that's a guy portrayed by Samuel L. Jackson in the show, a.k.a. the Black Godfather of Harlem. And why would Moten talk to him about it? Well, he didn't have nothing better to do at the time because he was cooling his heels in the newly built federal detention center in Manhattan, facing a fresh 25-year sentence. Now, Frank Moten was actually one of the top targets of the federal government across the entire United States during the whole decade, or first half of the 70s, for running a cocaine and heroin conspiracy dating from 68 to 76 that distributed several $1 billion worth of dope. New York, Miami, Chicago, D.C. were all prime distribution hubs, with Miami, which had become the main entry point for Corsican H by the early 70s when New York got too hot. So that's interesting aside. As the dope game was getting big in the 60s, it was, if you were catching a flight from France or Spain to the U.S., you were subject to be thought that you were bringing in H. So then they started routing it into South America. But then if you flew into New York from South America, they thought you were bringing in H. They were mixing in C as well. But so Miami, actually, before it became the yayo capital for a couple years, was the H capital, and one of the biggest H seizures back in that era, like 500 keys pure from Corsica, was caught in a boat off the coast of Miami in the early 70s. But anyways, Moten, who the federal government itself in documents I read referred to as the Black Godfather of Harlem, was more than just a dealer. He was the glue that held different sets of people together. And this was one of the cases where the feds started to lay the blueprint for these elaborate conspiracy cases where they tie together all kinds of people who never even met each other. After Frank Matthews disappeared, they were searching for Frank Matthews, who had been the subject of Centac number 2. And Centacs were if you were the target of a Centac federal investigation, you were one of the top couple targets. And I think Moten became Centac number 20 or something. Frank Matthews had been Centac number 2. The guy testifying, named Brown, also testified he told Moten the scope of his drug activities as well as the identities of his customers and sources. Moten had extensive financial dealings with Brown from 1966 through 72, exchanging small denomination bills for large denomination bills. Moten received $60,000 in small bills every couple weeks for safekeeping. So this was Moten helping some other guy out in some other conspiracy, just changing over small bills into big bills, I guess, to easier to pay the plug or whatever. These weren't really overlapping conspiracies. Moten was in one conspiracy and he did a different crime, the money laundering, with someone in another conspiracy which tied him together. Your boy, Frank Lucas, the American gangster, one of his great pieces of work for the police, because you should know he didn't testify against a single corrupt cop and he sent a bunch of people to prison. Don't let the movie fool you. Frank Lucas, to tie into what I was just saying about overlapping conspiracies, Frank Lucas put together a bunch of people, heroin dealers in New York, into a conspiracy of which they were convicted by informing the feds that each of these 2 or 3 different rings, which were large rings, bought their cut from the same chemist, even though they didn't work together. They didn't get the H together, they didn't deal together, they didn't money launder together. They simply got their cut from the same pharmacist, and Lucas informed them of that, and they were all roped into a conspiracy together just because of that. So Frank Moten was a big deal. So George Plimpton arrives at the Metropolitan Correctional. Interesting how times changed. Back in 1977, when Moten was hit with 25 years, the federal system was much smaller. You pretty much had to be a bank robber. Maybe you did an unaliving on an Indian reservation. You stole mail, or you were a kingpin or a mafia member, right? You weren't a street gang member. And that federal detention center was newly constructed, so it was nice. Plimpton makes visiting Moten sound like going to see his buddy at a hotel almost. Carpeted floors, or playing ping pong. Moten introduced Plimpton to other inmates, walked them around. They're all kind of lounging. Even though these are guys serving long times, there were he introduced them to some Croatian bombers, like serious people, but they're playing ping pong, they're sitting around. Him and Plimpton have a seat and some chairs. So Frank Moten tells Plimpton he actually had been to the Chicken Man, the house where the robbery happened, the Chicken Man's house the night before, to gamble. There was actually a weekend-long gambling and gangster party in Atlanta.
And after that big fight, here on Hander Drive, a robbery took place that occurred at the time of a party. From that robbery, headlines were made all over the world about the robbery itself.
But when he pulled up to Chicken Man's house at 2 a.m., he saw that the blinds were closed and joked that the police were raiding the place and didn't want anyone to see. Yet when they went and parked their car and went inside, they were greeted by shotguns and one guy with a silenced pistol standing at the front door. Moten arrived as the robbery was ending. It had actually started at 10 a.m. It ended about 2 hours after Moten got there. And Frank Moten had actually helped set the party up. He described himself to George Plimpton as a gambler by profession and who dealt in coke on the side, which he admitted to. So at that time, dealing in coke was considered maybe like we might think about dealing in weed now. He denied the H dealing, but that's what he got convicted for and got all the time for. Now, to also explicate the centrality of Moten's role in New York, Harlem's underworld, which was the biggest black underworld in the country. Well, it's where the Italians and blacks met as well, so it was a huge criminal entrepot. I found an article in a New York paper where the journalist was at a meeting of black Harlem numbers operators in the early 70s, and this Jimmy Breslin is a famous writer about New York. Some 3-digit number a bunch of people played, or someone played big money on it. So the numbers banks took a big hit. While Jimmy Breslin was there, Frank Moten happens to call from prison just to talk. So he's tapped in with the top numbers operators. He probably came out of that world. The numbers guys provided a lot of the bank for the initial drug stuff. Moten probably was in both. The feds definitely refer to him as the Black Godfather of Harlem, and a reference of a Council of 12. How does that interact with Nicky Barnes' Council of 7? hard to say. They were operating at the same time, but they had different rings going on. They must have had some overlap. I think Moten more so had a lot of stuff going on in other cities, more so than street level stuff in New York, but I didn't get into the intricacies of the case. Now, as Plimpton's interviewing Moten, you really see the difference in the caliber of especially what sort of black men would have gone into serious crime back then versus now. Very sophisticated, erudite guy that probably born in a different time wouldn't have chose crime if he had more opportunities. His hobbies were wild boar hunting in Spain, bird hunting in Georgia, and collecting very rare and very expensive firearms. So back to the party. So Chicken Man is suspected because he had long underwear. Moten and other key people grill him, and they decide, nah, Chicken Man didn't have nothing to do with it. But the police are running, of course, their own investigation because this was an embarrassment for the city of Atlanta on its big entree into the world stage with this big sporting event. And the thread that unraveled the case for the police wasn't hard to find. It was a sawed-off shotgun used in a robbery that had been dropped right on the front lawn. They traced it to a guy named Houston Hammonds who claimed he bought it for someone at a pawn shop. One piece of evidence led to another, and they start looking for these guys, Cadillac Richard and Fast Eddie. But Frank Moten and them figured out who they were first, and apparently got to them all first because the police never put anybody in custody. Them bodies popped up. So Frank Moten says a guy, Cadillac Richard, and his chief enforcer, Fast Eddie. They were from, well, they were, Fast Eddie was from New Brunswick, Georgia, which is a small town outside of Atlanta. Then Cadillac Richard might have been from New York or had come up from the South earlier. So they get into some heavy stuff in New York. What's heavy? Heavy is above heroin. Heavy is kidnapping and murder. Cadillac was the leader, and Fast Eddie was his chief henchman, and he was a known undertaker. Frank Moten says that not long before the fight night heist, Fast Eddie had murked a fearsome guy called Bulletproof on a Harlem street corner. So these were dangerous people, as were many people in Harlem at that time. As a matter of fact, I was looking around articles for this story, and I found the holy grail of crime stuff. I know we all like to compare homicide rates of cities, but cities are large, right? So to say that LA or New York has this or that murder rate, well, you got to look at it at a precinct level, and it's hard to get that data. But the New York Times in like 1973 published all the precincts in New York and the number of each kind of crime. And then and the population, so you could calculate a rate. And all the way back there in 72, during the H era, all of Harlem, but the two central districts of central Harlem, Black Harlem, I think the 28th and the 30th, with 150,000 people, they might have had 220 murders. And this is in a couple square miles.
Heroin is a way of dealing with the fact that those inequities exist.
If you've got money, you can buy heroin. There's no shortage of heroin in Harlem. I might add that you don't see 600 or 700 people standing.
Sterling Johnson is New York Special Prosecutor. His jurisdiction, narcotics law enforcement.
They're in abandoned buildings, they're in bars, they're in apartments, but we can get heroin as easy as you can get a package of cigarettes.
What Howard Telever can making a film about narcotics in New York City. You know anything about that?
Yeah, there is murder.
Are you involved in that?
Yeah, I'm involved.
To what extent? How are you involved?
The doctor, it's well, and the other were given that, and they're down, so the, oh, like, rapper about
Are you doing a film about drugs?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So you just go around and just ask him informal questions, like you ask this kid, why did he do it?
Yeah, right.
Well, why don't you find out where he got them from?
Where do you think he got some from?
They came from Asia somewhere, ain't he?
How did they get here? How did they get right here?
Now, that's what you find out.
Well, I'm trying to.
The 28th precinct had the highest homicide rate for any city, for any precinct I've ever seen in any city ever. There was 100 homicides with 50,000 people in less than a square mile, and then you had the 30th that wasn't quite as bad, was almost. So really the epicenter of the drug business at that time and the birth of it at a vast scale. On one side of, Lenox? Or Fifth Avenue? You got East Harlem, Spanish Harlem, which used to be Italian Harlem. Italians had the dope. And right across the other side of Lenox or Fifth, wherever Black West Harlem starts, that's who they were giving it to. So this is where you can see you wonder why black neighborhoods became the drug centers and the violence centers. Italians put the dope there, amongst other things, but that certainly was part of it. But so Fast Eddie and Cadillac Richard are part of this extremely violent Harlem underworld. That's what was documented in like Superfly or something. And apparently Cadillac Richard graduated up to the dope game, and he had large sums of money, but they were also still doing robbery. So he's selling dope, but I think he liked robbing. And they did a job on Long Island very similar to the Atlanta heist. They got a house. They passed out invitations to big fellas and said, be at the corner of, say, whatever, 65th in Amsterdam at 9 p.m. on Saturday. A limo will pick you up. And they were brought to this house thinking they were going to gamble. They were all robbed. So Cadillac Richie, the character played by Terrence Robert, didn't need to set up this robbery. He wasn't a desperate person. And the who's who of the black underworld was there. Not just New York, but Philly, Baltimore, D.C., Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles. In fact, if the feds had better intelligence gathering and analysis capabilities at the time, they could have rounded up most of the old black mafia that had formed in the mid-'60s and were vacuuming in hundreds of millions in drug profits and numbers monies off the streets of inner-city Americans. And so the robbery, like I said, started at 10 a.m. They had a guy in the front yard with a walkie-talkie, and they made one of the hosts of the party sit in a lawn chair out front. So it looked like, everything was okay. The guys had shotguns just for intimidation, but remember, Moten said one guy had a silencer. He surmised that was Fast Eddie, the Undertaker, because if someone was going to be whacked, they didn't want to use the shotgun to be noisy. That was to intimidate people. He was the one that was actually going to pop somebody's top if they got out of line. And he finishes his description of Cadillac Richard Wheeler and Fast Eddie Parker as they were nothing Robin Hoodie about these two guys. They were rough. They took care of people who gave them trouble. And like when they killed Bulletproof, they killed some girl that was a bystander too by mistake. Now, of course, there were several other people that were with them and did the robbery. Some of them got found down in Georgia. I think 2 of them were found killed in Georgia. And then a couple were found killed in the Bronx. And as for Cadillac Richard and Fast Eddie, well, they were the last 2 standing. And Cadillac Richard was actually living with a woman, an Italian woman, who had left her husband, who had been high-ranking in the New York State Department of Corrections, who was a square, but she's living with this guy. And one day, Fast Eddie comes and says, I need some help getting something out the car. Richard goes downstairs, Cadillac Richard, pop, pop. Fast Eddie bumped him off. The Black Mafia had gotten to, Frank Moten maybe, had gotten to Fast Eddie and knew he was maybe the only guy that could have got his partner, Richard, so they paid him to do that. And then Fast Eddie was wanted up and down the East Coast for all sorts of homicides, robberies. He kind of, what happened to him? Fast Eddie got caught. Oh, he was going to be bumped off on the street. He got caught in a cab with a grenade he got caught in a cab with a gun like a few weeks after that. Now, couldn't really follow his trail as to whether he cut a deal with the feds. He went to federal prison. Not sure. I would imagine. Who knows? Really hard to know. That would be interesting to know. So that's what happened to people that did the big heist. But a cat like Richard, adrenaline junkie, these guys already had a lot of money and they set up this heist. Recurring theme, upcoming documentary, Beyond Street Dreams. There's two kind of people at the top of the food chain in the streets. Those are in it for the money, and some are in it for violence. Some are in it for thrills, and even the people that are in it for money are definitely in it for some thrills. So, an audacious robbery of the who's who of it would have been like robbing. If the mafia had a thing where all the bosses of all the families came and you robbed it all. When they broke in the house of one mob boss in Chicago, 9 bodies got dropped behind that. So you can imagine. So everyone in the heist, as far as we know, got bumped off, except Fast Eddie, who got taken into custody before he could. And as for Frank Moten, he was convicted along with a guy, Frank Moten of Englewood, New Jersey, Angel Rodriguez of Miami, William Hightower of Washington, D.C., 2 women, Yvonne Chenault of Chicago and Lois Sampson of D.C., were also convicted. And then the prosecutors said they had been found guilty of a conspiracy and the distribution of more than 150 pounds of coke and more than 26 pounds of heroin. That's just what they got found guilty of. Several $100 million in street value. But Frank Moten, kind of a Frank Matthews type of guy, but he got 25 years. He sat down and gave an interview about this. True, George plucked him because he didn't have nothing else to do. Of course, he didn't admit he had anything to do with anybody getting killed, but so some real hardcore people. It wasn't all glitz and glamour. In fact, very little of it is glitz and glamour in Underworld. It's just the part you see or hear about in a song or in a movie. But Fast Eddie and Cadillac, Richard Wheeler were deadly, and Harlem was deadly, and everyone in this caper ended up dead, and Frank Moten ended up with 25 years. And I think he died in prison, but I'm not sure. Al Prophet American, no.